My name is Matthew Goodman. I work on international economic policy here at CSIS, and am delighted to welcome you on behalf of CSIS and the Simon Chair. This is part of a series that we do called the Economic Statecraft Speaker Series, and it's generously supported by Alcoa Foundation, and we appreciate that support. We do a lot of things under this series, but today we thought it would be quite topical to talk about the subject of trade, which has been in the news, if you hadn't noticed, recently. So we're going to have we've got a dream team up here that I'm going to introduce in a minute to talk about this, and Mike Froman after that from 11:30. But let me first make a couple of administrative announcements. First of all, in the case of some sort of security event, basically follow me is the bottom line instructions. There are exits behind here that go down, there's stairs down to the alley, or you can go out front and there's a little park across the street where we assemble. So that's point one. Point two is we're going to do a break from 11:15 to 11:30, and there'll be coffee up on the Sam Nunn Terrace. There are restrooms basically behind me here that you can get to around this way. Finally, if you have any phones or other noisemakers, if you could set those on stun or otherwise silence them, we'd appreciate that. So with that, let me just say that I've been watching trade like many people for decades, and there have been some heated debates along that road, but I don't think it's ever been like this. I don't remember a time when it's been this heated and there's been as much controversy around the topic of trade and trade policy. There are some underlying trends that are worrisome in trade itself. Global trade for the last 3 or 4 years has been growing more slowly than global GDP, and that's historically an anomaly. It's always grown faster than the global economy. Protectionism, not in massive 1930s ways, but in small ways, has been rising, and the WTO and independent groups have sort of cataloged all of that, and it's quite worrisome. Global trade negotiations have been stalled. The Doha round is effectively dead. Multilateral negotiations are focused on some specific areas, but even those are not moving as fast as they could or should. Mega regional agreements like TPP and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, even the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is another Asian arrangement, is not moving very far, very fast. And then, of course, you have all this anti-trade and anti-globalization rhetoric and positions being taken by presidential candidates on both sides of the aisle against trade, which is, again, first, as far as I know, with so much anti-trade rhetoric from both sides of the aisle. I will say that the election, I think I learned some things from that debate and the election results about trade. I think there's obviously a lot of anxiety about trade and economic change in other ways, technology and other changes in the economy, and I think a sense that we folks in this room and in Washington don't understand those anxieties and certainly are not delivering the solutions to those problems. Whether it's looking at policies like adjustment assistance or retraining and education, or wage and income support of some kind, we're not delivering things that people want. And I think we all need to listen more and understand what those anxieties are and what the solutions may be to these issues. And the Simon Chair is going to be doing more work. We're already starting to do more looking at those questions, which we haven't done as much on in the past. But I also think, and I think most people on this panel and in this room would agree, that trade is kind of also getting a bit of a bum rap. It's become a poster child for a lot of anxieties that aren't directly related to trade. Trade has provided broad benefits for our economy, for the global economy. If they understood it, I think 600 million Chinese would agree that trade and globalization have been a good thing for them. And so I think part of the problem here is that we're not doing a good enough job explaining trade, and that's the purpose of today, is to help try to explain things in a specific way, not just say it's good for the economy or it's, there's broad benefits, but to look specifically what's at stake and what some of the areas of trade policy are important for the U.S. Economic and, in some cases, strategic interests. So we have, as I say, a dream team up here to help do this. I think they're probably all familiar to all of you. I've had the pleasure of working with everybody up here. In fact, when I was young, I wanted to grow up to be these folks. Delighted to have go down in order here. Victoria Espinel, who is president and CEO of BSA, the Software Alliance. She's worked for both Democratic and Republican White Houses, including the Obama White House, where we had the pleasure of working together when she was IP, Intellectual Property Enforcement Coordinator. And so delighted to have Victoria here. You have more background on her in the biographical information. Next to her is Peter Allgeier, who again I'm sure is very familiar to people in this room. He's president of Nauset Global LLC, a consulting firm, but I think you all know him as former deputy U.S. Trade Representative, former president of the Coalition of Services Industries, and so it's just a thrill to have Peter here with us as well. Thank you, Peter. And at the end, another familiar figure, Bill Reinsch, who is Senior International Trade and Government Relations Advisor at Kelly Drye, a law firm here in town, but again, I think probably better known to most of you here as longtime president of the National Foreign Trade Council, and before that, he was Undersecretary of Commerce for Export Administration, and he is a friend and mentor and has taught me a lot about this subject, so I very much appreciate his willingness to join us here today. So I have talked a lot. I now want to let you talk. And the first thing I'm going to do before we delve into individual areas that you each have a lot of expertise and knowledge about is I want to ask each of you, and I'm maybe going to start with Peter because you've been doing sort of trade policy at USTR for a long time, sort of what your diagnosis is of the point we're at in trade and trade policy. You can disagree with aspects of what I said or enhance that and add other points, but what do you think is going on? How did we get here?
Okay, well, thanks, Matt. Well, as you pointed out, there is a lot of disenchantment or really widespread opposition to trade and to trade agreements, certainly here in the United States, but we're also seeing it in Europe and in other developed countries primarily. And a big part of it in the United States, obviously, is the concern about manufacturing and what has happened to our manufacturing sector and the people who have worked in manufacturing. And if you look at the statistics over the last 30 years, manufacturing production in the United States has increased about 85%. But then you look at the employment picture, and employment in manufacturing over that same period, and mostly since 2000, has declined 30%. And so, and a lot of people, of course, attribute this to trade, but I think when people look at it, and a lot of the research points out, that really what the main factor, the overwhelming factor in this is change in technology. And so that's the situation with manufacturing. Now, another big part of it, and this is something that Victoria will talk about, is the digital revolution. And the digital revolution is spreading obviously across our entire economy and almost every aspect of our lives. So there is a great need for people who are digitally literate in their jobs, and not just those who are in Silicon Valley or someplace like that, but in every single business. More and more of the business depends in one way or another on the digital economy. And the problem here, as I see it, is that we have a huge mismatch between the skill demands of the digital revolution and the skill supply, that we still have a mismatch between people who are prepared for I'll call them brain jobs, versus people who previously have had muscle jobs. And I mean, there still are a lot of need for various kinds of muscle jobs, but not to the same extent that there has been in the past, and certainly in the future, it's going to be a smaller and smaller percentage of the working population. So obviously these issues, and particularly the one about manufacturing, were important in the campaign, and because they were important to the general public. And the response, as Matt pointed out, from both candidates was, we need to be more aggressive in defending America's interests and promoting America's interests. Now, in terms of defining what America's interests are going forward, a little sketchier there in terms of the prescription being given by, from my point of view, the incoming administration. And I think one of the things that perhaps we can talk about is, you know, it's going to be a more aggressive trade policy. And there is aggressive smart, and there is aggressive dumb. And so the challenge, I mean, we're going to have to deal with a more aggressive trade policy. And in some instances we should. But we need to make sure that, as I said, it's aggressive smart, not aggressive dumb.
Okay, we will come back to that because that is kind of the $64,000 question, is how to get that smart policy right, and what advice we'd have for the new administration. So thank you for raising that. But Victoria, before I ask you specifically about the digital economy and the issues that you're working on, again, what's your take on what's going on and why we, you know, how we reach this point on trade?
So I was thinking, you gave us a great setup, and as you were talking, so many thoughts came into my head. I was thinking, I'm going to need a winnow. So I've tried to winnow that to three. One is, you made the point that concern about trade has been around for a long time, but it certainly seems like it has escalated to a certain extent. And I think, but you know, the reality, I think we should all recognize the reality that trade has been a difficult and controversial issue for many years. Trade votes are always difficult votes. So it may feel worse now, but it's not like, it's not a totally new situation. So the second thing I would say is, I think trade and what we mean by trade has changed. Certainly it has for my industry, and I think we'll probably come back to this when we're talking more about the digital economy and the data economy. But you know, trade policy needs to keep up with where the global economy is going. That sounds kind of obvious, but and I think this USTR has started to try to do that, but I think we need to see more progress there. The nature of trade and what we mean by trade, certainly for my industry, has changed a lot. And if trade is going to continue to be one of the drivers of the global economy, as I think it should, it then needs to reflect what the global economy is becoming. And so I think that's a big shift. And I think there's actually some room for optimism there. And I'm happy to come back and talk about why I think there is room for optimism in terms of where trade is going. The third thing I would say, and we probably need to have more conversation about this as well, is, you know, you talked about some of the fears. I think it is, I would agree with you that I think putting all of those fears on trade is probably misplaced. But I think there are real concerns about what is happening in the United States and the impact that's had on jobs. I can certainly tell you from the perspective of my industry, it's something that we care about a great deal. So if you look just at the software industry, we create 10 million jobs in the United States. And additionally, we are an industry that has more jobs than we can fill. We have empty jobs in software because we don't have people with the skills and the training to fill them. So we are in a very different place than many other industries where we have, you know, by 2020, they said there's going to be 1.4 million more computing jobs in the United States. We only have about 400,000 students in the pipeline to fill those jobs. We have a real pipeline issue. And so I think focusing on training and education is certainly something our industry is focused on. I think we need to get our governments more focused on it. And I think that's, you know, that needs to be part of the narrative that we're talking about as we go forward.
Great. Again, another great topic to come back to. Bill, what about you? What's your sort of take overall?
Well, after this, I'm sort of in the position of what I learned when I was working on Senate staff, where people talk about Senate debate. Everything's been said, but not everyone has said it. And so, you know, here I am saying, yeah, good, you're right. Let me try to add a slightly different tack. I think we've agreed trade is a scapegoat. Not a surprise, the gains tend to be long-term and diffuse. The costs tend to be short-term and specific. That's not news. At the same time, it's more than a scapegoat because the gains have been disappointing, and the losses have been, I think, as a consequence of global market integration, the losses have been sharper and greater than people expected, and the gains have, in part because of the state of the economy, have been less than people have expected. Part of the answer is we need to do a better job of talking about the gains, which I think we haven't done. But the more important part of the job is to make sure the gains actually accrue, and that the system is structured in such a way that people benefit from what's happening. And we can talk a little bit more about that if you want. I think, though, at the same time, the election creates kind of an institutional dilemma for us that we need to think about above and beyond just the argument about trade policy. It seems to me we're kind of at a fork in the road. As Yogi would say, hey, we should just take it. That's the answer. But in this case, we have a number of people that are really talking about a policy that is more isolationist, more protectionist, and in some respects more nativist than a policy of outward-looking expansion and global integration. That's not new for the United States. We really pursued those policies the first 150 years of our history. It wasn't until the Depression and the Roosevelt administration that we really turned into an international country, if you will, and on a sustained level. And post-World War II, what we spent a lot of time on investment in is constructing a global architecture of institutions and rules that, among other things, work to our benefit, which I think is one reason why we did it, but also worked, I think, to the benefit of a larger number of countries by creating some sense of order out of multilateral chaos. I think we may be reaching a point where there are people that are challenging that order. There are already people in other countries challenging that order. China is probably the best example of a country that has not been a defender of the existing system. And we have been, and I think it's benefited us. We are in a situation now where we face a lot more competition globally, not only for economic gain and market access, but also for global leadership. And the maintenance of and further construction of a system that works to our advantage. I think we have an incoming administration that has a lot of skepticism about that and may take us down an older road in our history. And one of the things that I worry about a lot, which is macro more than the micro question of what do we do about trade policy domestically, one of the things I begin to worry about a lot is that we have competitors for global leadership. And you're going to see this next week in Davos when Xi Jinping is going to be there and we're not. And you're going to see somebody else claiming the mantle, if you will, of global leadership in the economic sphere. People may or may not buy that, but I think there's a trend here that is important. And it's not only important from some sort of thing that all the foreign policy people, of which I am not one, do about the U.S. role in the world is important. It's important economically because the system contains rules about how companies do business with each other, how intellectual property is protected, how data is stored, or they don't have rules in some cases, and they have rules about tariffs and things as mundane as that. That system's been advantageous for us, and I think we want to maintain that system. And in order to maintain it, I think we have to maintain our role in it. And I'm worried that it's going to be eroding, partly because I thought a lot of people here have lost confidence in it, and which the election reflects. And I'm not sure that the incoming administration has much enthusiasm for it.
This is such an easy panel to moderate. It's like having wind-up toys. I just wind it up, and they can do this all for me. I don't have to do anything. It's fantastic. I'd like to just let you guys continue to talk, but let me try and steer it a little by diving a little deeper, and then we'll come back up and talk about these broader issues again. So Peter, again, to start with you on services. So you spent a lot of time working on that. Before I actually ask you about services trade itself. First of all, what are services? Because I think of services as what are cross-border services in particular, because we all think of haircuts or restaurants. Those aren't tradable things.
Yet.
Yet. That's actually a good point. So help us define what we're talking about here and why they matter to the United States.
Well, services are by far the largest sector of the economy. And yeah, we often think of services as what happens to us in our daily lives, but a lot of the services that we do have in our daily lives either are traded internationally or they can be traded internationally. So services, obviously they include the whole array of financial services, of banking, of insurance, and so forth. The whole telecommunications area of services. So you think of AT&T and Verizon. And then the whole digital area of services, whether it's Microsoft or Facebook or Google or any of the other services that we all take advantage of. It's services, logistics services. You think of FedEx and UPS. All sorts of services. And the services are integrally related to manufacturing. And if you look at businesses today, there's a misconception about manufacturing trade and services trade. And what I mean by that is that when an automobile comes across the border, let's say from Germany, Customs looks at it and it says, okay, here's a $40,000 BMW. That's $40,000 of manufacturing imports by the United States. But when you look at how BMW is manufacturing and what it needs to manufacture, a huge part of what it's doing are services. Obviously the financial services, the logistics of moving the cars, engineering and design services, accounting, the communications and public relations, advertising services. So a few years ago, the WTO did an exercise and said, let's look at a whole range of products, so-called manufacturers, that are going across borders, and let's break it down. And what part of the manufacture is really, tightening the wrench? Well, you don't use wrenches anymore, but the robots manufacturing the car, and all these other ancillary but necessary services that are part of BMW's operations. So they did this, and they did this more or less globally, looking across a whole bunch of countries. And they said, if we look at the customs figures now, something like 25% of world trade is services. But when we break it down and take out the services part of a washing machine or an automobile or an airplane, we find out that actually services are 48% of world trade. So there's all these services that are kind of hidden under the guise of manufacturers, but are absolutely essential to all these manufacturing businesses and the products that they produce. Now, in the case of the United States is the leader by far in internationally traded services. One example of that is that we run $250 billion trade surplus in services. And frankly, the United States is the most innovative in introducing international trade services. Even the Europeans are concerned that they're not competing well with the United States because we are the innovators. So this is something that one hopes the incoming administration will understand, and understand that success in manufacturing also means success in services, and in terms of US competitiveness down the road, they need to be paying attention to what are the rules of the road on services, and are we, who are the leaders in services, the ones who are defining what the rules should be. And this will get a lot also to the part that Victoria has responsibility for, the digital economy. because services are completely dependent upon the digital economy. And again, it's the US that has been using its leadership in the digital economy to support its leadership in services.
So when it comes to actual trade in goods, it's fairly easy to deal with at least the border problems by cutting tariffs and integrating and increasing trade that way. With services, it seems not as easy to get services integration across the globe. What are the main problems for services cross border, and what needs to be done to address them?
Well, there are a number. I mean, I'd say the first one is again the digital economy and the ability to move your data and to store your data where it makes the most sense. It doesn't make sense to have to hold your data in every jurisdiction in which you're operating. Regulatory issues are huge in services. I mean, it's pretty obvious in the case of financial services, but it's true in all the other services. I mean, you think of something like express delivery, and all right, what are the rules under which our express delivery companies operate in a place like China? Well, they're very, very restrictive, or they don't even know what the rules are. The rules keep changing, or they're so obscure. So the sorts of things that we more or less take for granted in terms of rulemaking, transparency in regulations, that the regulations apply equally to a domestic operator and a foreign operator, which is often not the case, that companies, U.S. companies, are they competing against state-owned operators, which have different rules applying to them than to our companies or other foreign companies that are operating. So I would say the digital issues and regulatory issues are across the board for services two of the highest priorities looking forward in
Okay,
trade
well, you've
policy.
perfectly teed up the next two panelists, because
Thank you.
I want to turn to, and I will actually come back to you on a definitional question in a sec if we have time, but Victoria, let me pull you in here, and Peter's already sort of, I think, delivered your punchline, but first of all, definitionally, what is the digital economy, and why does it matter in this context?
So, the digital economy is a term that's used a lot. I'm actually chairing a group at Davos next week on the digital economy and society. And I think, one of the things that we're talking about is exactly how you define the digital economy. But for purposes of this discussion, let's define it as industries that are producing things that are digital, right? So things that are in digital form, software being an example, therefore, of the digital economy. And I think one thing that's important to note about the digital economy and kind of this, you're talking about the economic slowdown, is that the digital economy is actually performing quite well. Businesses that are in the digital economy have grown 30% in the last 5 years. So the digital economy is outperforming the rest of the global economy, and that's not growth that we want to stop. But what I would like to do is actually go kind of one step down below the digital economy and talk about the data economy, because that I think matches up very much with what Peter was saying. So in my industry, we talk a lot about this data revolution moment that we are in right now, and this is a fact that is widely known, but every time I say it out loud, it kind of amazes me yet again. So if you stand here today on January 13, 2017, and you look back to the beginning of recorded time, to when humanity started recording the knowledge that it acquired, 98% of the data that exists, that has been recorded, has been created in the last 2 years. That's not even exponential growth. That's growth in information and data on a scale so far beyond anything that humanity has seen before that it's hard for us to get our minds around it. That's going to have impacts far beyond trade policy. That's going to have and global economic policy. That's going to have societal impacts that are, I think, going to have enormously beneficial consequences for the world at large, but are also going to think change a lot of the ways that we think about how we live our lives and the economy. So we're living in this moment, and I think it's also important to remember that's happened. We're still at the beginning of that. So I think it is incredibly important, therefore, when we are thinking about something like trade policy, to be thinking about how trade policy and economic policy needs to adjust to try to account for that. And in terms of data, one of the things that I think is really interesting, at least interesting to me as a former trade negotiator, is you have something that is already so important to the global economy, and yet we don't have enforceable trade rules on data by and large. And I was an intellectual property negotiator when I was at USTR. You know, one of the highlights, and always will be one of the highlights of my career, is being a negotiator for the United States at USTR. But one of the things that the United States had done that was very prescient in the 90s is realized how big a driver of the global economy intellectual property was going to be. So the United States went out and negotiated trade rules on intellectual property. And at the time, that was considered unusual. There wasn't a consensus that intellectual property should be part of global trade rules. Now, I think you can argue about what those rules should be, but I think it's obvious to everyone that there should be international and global rules on intellectual property. Well, data is kind of at that moment now. There are not strong enforceable rules in the WTO on data, which makes sense because it wasn't part of the global economy when the WTO was brought into being the way it is today. TPP was the beginning of having an international framework on data, but that is a big gap in terms of our international trading system rules right now, and is a gap that clearly needs to be filled. And I guess going back to what I said in the beginning, part of the reason I am optimistic about at least one part of the trade agenda going forward is I think that gap is too big and too important to the US economy to be overlooked. So I am optimistic that any administration, including the next administration coming in, as they're looking to negotiate a trade agenda that will create jobs in the United States, will see that as an area to focus on. And I'm happy to elaborate further on what I mean by that, like what, but I'll
well, I mean, let me ask,
moment.
I do want you to do that, but let me just ask in the cross-border dimension of this, why is it so important for data to flow internationally? Why does it not flow as smoothly as it should, and how's government involved in this, and why are they trying to stop data from flowing? Okay,
that's great. So thank you. And there's data localization and cross-border data flows, kind of the terms of art, but they're like hideously opaque terms. So I'm glad you asked me that. So when I'm talking about data, often people think of personal data, and that makes sense because their own data is often what people are interacting with. But there's an enormous amount. In fact, the majority of data is commercial data. So a practical example of that is every time you're on a plane, that plane now, this was not true years ago, but it is true today, that plane is throwing off a terabyte of data with every transatlantic flight.
Terabyte of data. On one flight.
Enormous amounts of data.
It's a lot.
That are
sounds like a lot.
It is a lot, and that data is measuring things like the wind velocity or the fuel efficiency. And so Boeing is then using that data to figure out both how to make its planes more safe and to make its planes more efficient. And that is happening in agriculture, in transportation, in manufacturing, and literally every economic sector that we have is now depending upon data to do what it does better, to either make its manufacturing goods or services more efficient, more responsive to customer demands. That data and the ability for our companies to use that data as effectively as possible, it needs to move back and forth. If you have a plane that is flying from the United States to Europe, you need to be able to send that data back to the United States so that Boeing can use it in a way that's effective. If you are looking at agricultural data and measuring weather patterns around the world to try to make sure that we can grow crops in the United States or in any country around the world as well as we can, you need to be able to share that data around the world. It's true in medical research. It's true in every field. The problem that we are facing is that there are countries that are either considering or put in place policies to say, we don't think that data should be able to move across borders. We want to keep that data here inside of our country. And one practical way that manifests itself is saying data centers have to be built here in this country if you want to be able to operate in our country. So instead of having data centers in the United States, creating jobs in the United States, trading partners are requiring that data centers be built and the jobs that go with them be built inside of their countries. And there's a variety of reasons why governments might pursue those policies, but that's a practical way that
Can
they
you give
manifest
a
themselves.
sense of one or two of those reasons? Is it to do with their citizens' own privacy? Is it commercial?
So I think I think there's a variety of reasons, and there are some legitimate reasons a government would want to keep data. So data that was essential to its national security, I think, is a reason that we would all agree a government might want to keep its data very close to itself. But I think there are times when privacy or security concerns are mentioned as reasons, but they may sometimes be the legitimate reason. There are other times I think they are not. I think there are certainly governments around the world that are looking to try to build their domestic industry, and they see this as a way of slowing down the U.S. I mean, this is an area where the U.S. is a leader, and having restrictions here limits or impedes companies' ability to expand their consumer base, and that hurts jobs back in the United States. It hurts our competitiveness, and that is a motivator. Maybe not always the motivator, but it is a motivator.
You mentioned that the TPP was trying to get at some of that rulemaking and dealing with some of those barriers. What would it have done? What will it do, I should say, because I still believe TPP is going to happen eventually. I'm just not going to predict when. How does it address some of those things?
TPP was the first trade agreement that had a default rule that said data should move back and forth across borders. It had a default rule that said a government cannot require a data center to be built within your borders in order for a company to do business in your country. And there were exceptions to that, as there are always exceptions in trade agreements. But that was the default rule. So that does not exist in any trade agreement. And we need to have those sort of default baselines on an international basis. And I also am confident we will get there, whether it's through TPP or whether it's through other mechanisms. I think as I said, I think it's just too important to the global economy for it not to be addressed.
Where else are we talking about these things other than in these trade agreements?
TPP has been the main place. And so if TPP is not going to move forward, and I don't know that we actually know that, I think there's enough unpredictability in the system that I certainly wouldn't want to say that's 100%. But I think if it does turn out that TPP is not the mechanism, we will not stop pushing for those to have international rules in this area. One thing I would mention that I find interesting and something we definitely need to keep an eye on is the European Commission came out with an announcement on data flows 2 days ago, which said a number of things. But one of the things it said in that announcement is that it was going to start negotiating deals with Japan and South Korea on data. And as the Europeans are wont to do, as any country would be wont to do, they will then export their notion of what data flows means. And their notion is not as open and as expansive as the United States is. So I think that is, any former trade negotiator would look at an announcement like that and think that is definitely something the United States should be watching with some degree of caution. And if the Europeans are going to be out there talking to Japan and South Korea and other governments, we need to be out there talking to them as well. And with our vision of what open data looks like and data flows across borders.
Okay, fantastic. Lots more to ask about, but let me get Bill in here as well, because another chapter of TPP deals with state-owned enterprises. That word gets its own acronym, SOEs, but I don't think, again, that's all that well defined. What is a state-owned? Does a state-owned enterprise have to be something that's 100% owned and controlled by a government, or is there a problem that's broader than that, and what is the problem?
Well, when I was on the China Commission, one of my former colleagues once said that in China there were only two categories of companies: those that are owned by the government and those that shut up and do what the government tells them. And I think that was a bit of an overstatement, but it also illustrates that there's a range of behavior that probably is subsumed by the term. I mean, state-owned enterprise technically is an enterprise that's owned by the government, but in fact as you said, there are degrees. You can own it, you can control it, which means you own, if it's a stock thing, you own the majority of the stock, or even a controlling minority of the stock. But beyond that, even if you don't do either of those things, you can heavily influence it one way or the other. Chalmers Johnson years ago described Japan's policy as state developmental capitalism. which was not ownership of companies, but a heavy hand of guidance, if you will, by the state, suggesting that various companies do certain things, and in some cases suggesting to certain companies that they ought to combine and merge, or that you ought to work on this and you ought to work on that in order to prevent messy competition. So there's a range of things, and I think at the far end, it probably, in a way, one of the more pernicious things that happens is it ends up being sort of credit allocation and investment allocation. The state decides who gets the money, and that leads to, I guess I would say there's probably three problems. Two problems of discrimination and one problem of overcapacity. If the state is deciding who gets the money, and they decide that either by their ownership or by telling banks, lend to them, don't lend to them, several things are happening. One is that you're directing capital in one area, so somebody's not getting it. And that means there are other people in the economy that are not going to be able to grow or do the things they want to do because the market's not making the credit decision, so the government is. At the same time, it is inevitably discriminatory against competitors, which tend to be foreign competitors. So if you're being given governmental advantages, whether it's through credit allocation or non-tariff barriers or licensing restrictions or binational provisions, we've been known to do that. What you're effectively doing is giving a leg up to your guys as opposed to their guys. And I think from the country's standpoint, well, let me go before I talk about the good things. The third problem, which we're seeing a lot now, is it's almost inevitable when you get into the SOE game that you end up with overcapacity. And you see this particularly now in steel and aluminum, and particularly with China. I mean, the reality is, for all the flaws of the market, and there are many, that governments don't allocate capital as efficiently as the market does. And what governments tend to do is overshoot. They decide that an industry is important, semiconductors in Japan, in the 80s, autos, wherever, steel and aluminum, and they channel investment in that area. If it's state controlled, that's an easy thing to do. Even if it's not, people read tea leaves and they think, that's a growth area. The government's putting money in there, or the government's favoring that sector. I'll follow them. And what you end up with is more capacity than you need, which means more supply than you need. And then what you end up is people with what we're seeing right now in steel and I think aluminum too. People then you dump the product because you've got all this stuff. And then other countries have to match you if they're going to not lose market share, and then you get kind of a worldwide problem, which has happened over and over and over again. We're in the midst of it in the sectors I described, but it's not confined to them. There are people who will tell you, and I think with some argument, that there are advantages to state-owned enterprises. I think the main argument is various variations of the infant industry argument. Particularly if you're a developing economy, you're not going to get industrialization off the ground, the argument goes, unless the government takes a hand in the business and provides either protection or investment funds or both to nascent industries who, in the absence of that kind of help, would not be able to compete with established companies, foreign companies in the same sector. I think there's some truth to that. Whether it makes sense to be creating, 47 countries having steel industries is, kind of something else we can debate. But clearly, SOEs have permitted the development of important things over the world. Over history. I mean, the most obvious argument is Airbus, which I think really is a creation of government. I suspect if you were Boeing, you wouldn't be very excited about that. They're not. On the other hand, if you're Airbus, you say, well, we did the same thing with Boeing, so it's, everybody's guilty. I don't think the balance of guilt is nearly the same, but that's what's being litigated in the WTO. The point is, though, that a lot of countries, including developed countries, including this one, have, from time to time, with a good bit of success, allocated capital and government favoritism in one form or another to in specific areas that in order to achieve national policy goals. And we did it a lot a long time ago, so we tend to forget about that. And then when other people now do the same thing, we say, oh, you can't do that. That's sort of the way the game is played, I guess. So I don't, in contrast to what Victoria was talking about, what I'm talking about is old. The SOEs have been around forever, probably back to the Roman Empire. You're talking about things that are new. You're talking about things that are fairly new. This is old news. They're not going to go away. They're never going to go away. It's just too tempting.
It is old, but it hasn't been subject to international disciplines. And so
No.
what was new about TPP was it was trying to, for the first time, establish international rules on not how much you could own in a state-owned enterprise, but what state-owned enterprises could do.
To try to make them operate according to market principles. I think that's the underlying idea of what was going on in TPP, a recognition that you're not going to get rid of them, and nobody's going to agree to do that. But if you can make them operate according to market principles, price according to market principles, and deal with the market as if they were a private company, then you've at least leveled the playing field.
Okay, I'm conscious of time, and I really know there are a lot of smart people in the audience as well who have interesting thoughts and questions, so I want to give you time, and I think I'll just do that. I have another question for each of you, but I'll try to circle back and ask that afterwards if I have time. While you're thinking about a question, and there are microphones which will come, and please identify yourself and do ask a question. I just want to say about TPP that all three speakers have highlighted aspects of what are in TPP and what's at stake. And I think whether you call it TPP or you put it in some other format, these things are clearly critical to U.S. national interests, and one way or another, we're going to have to find our way back to rulemaking in these areas. And so, I think the logic brings us back to something like TPP eventually. In fact, I'd even say I'm going to stick my neck out, because the optimistic position on TPP has always been the correct position. That is, everything that was supposed to happen has happened. Not necessarily in the time that it was predicted to happen, but the agreement was reached and signed by the 12 members. And so I think there's every reason to believe we're going to eventually come back and implement it, except for the reasons that might get in the way. So with that, questions, please. If you have questions, again, there's a gentleman right there, and please do identify yourself.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Dan O'Flaherty, formerly of the National Foreign Trade Council, and I'm wondering, given the tenor of our recent election and the debate surrounding trade, what do you foresee as being the U.S. trade agenda, say, in the near term, in the next couple of years?
Are you addressing that to anyone in particular?
No. Not
anyone. Anybody want to start? Peter?
Yeah, I will. Well,
Bill?
go ahead.
Okay, let Bill go first this time.
I think in the short run, it's going to be primarily defensive. The president-elect is focused on domestic issues like creating jobs, bringing companies back, bringing manufacturing back, on the unfair practices of other people, which means, I think, sort of essentially playing defense. It means more enforcement. The current administration has been doing more enforcement anyway, so I'm not sure how much of an uptick you can make, but we could get into the weeds on that. I think you'll see more enforcement. I think that because I think the president-elect is also a fan of the grand gesture. I wouldn't be surprised to see an announcement that he's already said we're going to go after Chinese unfair trade practices. We're going to renegotiate NAFTA. So I'm assuming that we'll do both, which means there will be a negotiation. Mexico and Canada have said, okay, we'll talk. So I think that will happen. Whether it amounts to anything, we'll see. My view has tended to be that he's setting up two situations, those two, where inevitably he won't get everything he wants and then is going to have to make a decision. Do we fold, if you will, or agree to a compromise that will be the greatest compromise ever agreed to, or do we retaliate? And remains to be seen in that case. What I don't see is a lot of interest in, and this is what I was alluding to in the beginning, I don't see a lot of interest in working with international organizations or working within the WTO to move out the borders of market access. He's not talking about better IP rules. He's not talking about doing things about SOEs. He's not talking about changing the framework. What I'm worried about in the WTO is we'll lose a case. I mean, we always lose a few. We win more than we lose, but we'll lose one. And then there will be this wave of anger here. Well, they cheated us. We're going to leave. Now, I don't think that'll happen. Cooler heads will prevail. But it's fundamentally a defensive posture.
Victoria, did you want? No? Or
Yeah,
Peter?
well,
Go ahead.
I agree with that, but I would add to it one point where I disagree. I think, or potentially disagree. I think one thing that's interesting about the data trade policy issues is that they are not the subject of controversy. They are bipartisan issues, and I think there's been a pretty solid consensus on a bipartisan basis that the data issues are good for U.S. jobs and they're good for U.S. competitiveness. So I think as the president-elect is looking for a trade agenda that will create U.S. jobs, I think it would be very natural for him to navigate to the data issues and for that to be a focus for the next administration. And I think, so I think that is a place where we could have an affirmative trade agenda. We don't have international rules now. We need them. They're not issues that are controversial. There's a lot of bipartisan consensus around them, and they help create jobs here. So I think that could be, and I anticipate that that will be an aspect of the next administration's trade agenda.
But not one word said about that yet.
Not one word said.
Not one word said about that from
Yeah.
the incoming people that I know of.
Well, the administration is not in place yet.
I hope you're right.
Week to go. We'll test it then. Peter, just actually, as you answer the question, your take on this. What's the role of bilateral agreements? Because that does seem to be something that this administration. I mean, they have talked about that as a priority. Is that a good thing in itself? And how does that support or undermine the multilateral system?
Okay, well, first of all, I think in terms of the broader picture, I think there are certain things we can say almost certainly, and then there are other things that depend on a few factors. In terms of what we can say certainly, is the administration has said it is going to be more aggressive. And so, for sure, the administration will be more aggressive in things like anti-dumping and countervailing duty, for example. A question is, are they going to be aggressive smart or aggressive dumb? And I think a lot of that will depend on whether the business community steps up and speaks about its real interest. For example, the automobile industry. It would be a disaster for the automobile industry if the rules were that we're going to close down the auto trade, or we're going to put tariffs on auto trade between among the United States, Mexico, and Canada. The auto industry is so thoroughly integrated that it would destroy the North American auto industry. So one hopes, and it's true for many other industries, the degree of integration and globally with supply chains, which by the by, the United States has been a leader in setting up global supply chains. So, it would be reversing, and I think it's impossible to reverse. I mean, it really is the classic King Canute ordering the waves to recede, and even the president-elect can't do that. So what would be the thing to do? Well, I think for sure there will have to be more aggressive use of anti-dumping countervailing duty. I think with China, I mean, it's got to be tough with China. One thing that China wants very much is to be classified as a market economy. And there's no way that's going to happen in the near term, but the new administration should set out the criteria. If you're going to be treated as a market economy, these are the things that you need to have in place to be treated as a market economy. And it runs the gamut from the disciplines on state-owned enterprises to how you treat the digital economy, how you treat your investors, and so forth. In terms of other negotiations, just picking up, Matt, on your point about the TPP. The TPP, I mean, if you're going to look at new trade agreements and new trade policy and how you're going to change NAFTA, for example. It's ironic that the incoming administration has talked so poorly about, or negatively about TPP. There are an awful lot of things in TPP that you would want to take and, let's say, apply to NAFTA. So, for example, people worried about labor and environment. Well, the TPP has gone much further than any other agreement in terms of the labor standards that would be required of countries like Vietnam, for example, or the environmental standards. Similarly, introducing the digital disciplines there. Now, as for TPP itself, I think it's going to be necessary to go back to the TPP other members and say, look, guys, if I'm going to sell this at home, we're going to have to fix some of the things that were not right in TPP. So, for example, as Victoria said, the default position on data and localization was that you couldn't require localization. However, in financial services, you could, and that makes no sense. So that should be rolled back. I think that some of the rules on the state-owned enterprises are quite weak. So, for example, TPP focuses mostly on the behavior of state-owned enterprises in the export market, but doesn't really go to the core of how they are treating people in their own market, and so, or how they compete in their own market. So things like that could be put forward to the, or the auto rules of origin in TPP are much laxer than the case in the NAFTA. So one thing would be for the new administration to go back to the TPP partners who desperately want the agreement and say, all right, we need to make some changes and some fixes. In terms of bilaterals, I think that bilateral agreements that are of the quality that we have pursued in recent years are good, solid agreements that provide perhaps a basis for international agreements. I think we should offer to do a bilateral agreement with the UK. I mean, we've been doing the TTIP agreement with the EU, and there are lots of problems with that the European Commission has points of view that really are in conflict with ours, and we might do better with the UK. So those are some of the things that I think that we should be looking at. But one other thing in particular is we need to be looking at home of how we are dealing with the dislocated workers. And we have this Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, or a whole plethora of programs. Question is, how well are they working? And I think that we should take a very rigorous look at those sorts of programs, consider other things that we can do to support and to help people make the transformation, whether they are 50-year-old auto workers or they're youngsters coming along that have just come out of high school, and what kinds of skills do they need so that they can compete in the 21st century rather than sit back and be unemployed with their 20th century skills.
And again, we are going to be doing more programming on those subjects. I'm going to take another question from the audience, but I don't want to put you on the spot, Ambassador Hills, but seeing you there and hearing all this talk about NAFTA, since you negotiated NAFTA, I'd be interested in sort of your thoughts about any of this, but in particular about the prospect of doing something different in North America. I mean, trying to do something, whether tearing up and starting over or adding things or subtracting, but whatever you'd like to address. I'm not going to call you right this second. I'm going to ask the gentleman next to you first, and then maybe he can hand the microphone to you next. Right up here in the front, please, Alex.
My name is Dixon Ogwang. I'm the charge of the affair of the Uganda Embassy here in Washington, D.C. Between the 4th to the 6th of August 2014, there was an historic summit, the US-Africa Summit in Washington, D.C., and a lot was discussed, including US trade relations with Africa. What progress has been made, if any, since then in respect to the US trade relations with Africa? I would think any of you could answer this question. Secondly, in line with the rapid growth in technology, specifically I'd like to address Madam Victoria on this, and the digital advancement in the service sector of the global trade. Where do you find the place for Africa in the current trend of global trade? And finally, what should Africa do differently, if any, for it to be able to compete favorably in the global trade arena? Thank you very much.
Okay, all right, good. Three-part question about trade with Africa. Maybe Peter, you oversaw AGOA at some point in your career? Did you work on that?
Not really.
Not really, but you know enough
yes.
about it to talk about that and other aspects of our African trade policy.
Yeah, well, AGOA has had...
You want to spell that out for folks?
Oh, AGOA is the African Growth Opportunity Act. Right, and basically it was a set of tariff preferences for African countries that was meant to be more generous in terms of coverage and so forth than our broad preference program, the Generalized System of Preferences. And it has had a degree of success, but part of the problem is the limited product coverage, not because of the law so much as because of what the capabilities of most of the African countries have been. So if you look at what the trade flows are in AGOA, it's heavily petroleum products and textiles and apparel. Now a problem is that the textile and apparel business is incredibly competitive globally. And so what we have seen happen is that other countries that even don't have preferences, for example, Vietnam, have been more competitive than many of the African countries. And so the African countries have been losing market share in our apparel market, and there haven't been other industries for them to move into. And so a big question is, what is the capability of various African countries to diversify and to be less dependent upon textiles and apparel? Now, I think that in some cases, here too, the digital revolution can be very helpful, because a big constraint in Africa, of course, has been various of the physical infrastructures, whether it's the transportation infrastructure or the telecommunications infrastructure or the financial infrastructure. And so we do see instances within Africa of them not having to build a whole telecommunications network, but using the mobile capabilities. We see that in banking and so forth. And it does offer opportunities for small entrepreneurs to tap into the global system through telecommunications, through the logistics that are available. But I think
in some parts of Africa, they're way ahead of us in mobile banking and other services, right?
So the challenge is to put together the necessary infrastructure, institutional and physical, and a big part of that is the policies that they adopt, and whether they're adopting policies that facilitate these things, or whether they are policies that, because of state-owned enterprises or whatever, stand in the way of that.
Okay, Victoria, do you want to just add briefly?
Yes, so I want to thank you for that question, because I think there is a view that emerging tech, with cloud computing or data analytics, is something that's helpful to big companies or in developed countries, and that's just not true at all. In fact, I think you could argue that the efficiencies and the cost savings of cloud computing are even more important to small companies and startups that are trying to get themselves off the ground. And as Peter already said, we've seen really amazing things happening in African nations where small entrepreneurs are using the internet infrastructure and the digital economy to get out to a marketplace that they would not have been able to before, and even to leapfrog some building of some of the expensive traditional infrastructure. So in terms, you asked what African countries can do, I would say support an open internet, support digital trade policies, and also focus on training education for your young people so that they are as well suited and as best able to adapt to that as quickly as possible.
Okay, great. Ambassador Hill is okay. I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but I really am interested to hear your sort of reactions to this, and not just NAFTA, whatever you think.
Well, Matt, let me say that you have three great experts on your podium, and it's a pleasure to listen to all of you. Your specific question.
Oh, maybe the mic is not actually working. Just one sec. There we go. Try that one. Thanks.
Your specific question to me was with respect to the North American Free Trade Agreement, which Peter addressed beautifully. It would be a disaster if we were to pull out. The President has that authority in the agreement to give 6 months' notice and pull out. But it is not only the auto industry that would be devastated, it would be many of our industries and our competitiveness. Every dollar that we import from Mexico, 40 cents, is U.S. content. And when we think about how we manufacture goods, we need to get parts from the best places we can get them and do what we do best. The NAFTA has made us highly productive. I suspect that the business community will speak up, but we should encourage them to do so. I think there's a lack of knowledge of how hard the hit would be were we to withdraw. And there is a path out. President-elect has said he prefers bilateral negotiations. He could sit down with Mexico and update it, not tear it up, but we didn't have digital issues when we negotiated in the early 90s. We did not have some of the modern questions that we address today that all three of you have alluded to. But it was a template for U.S. trade. It was the first agreement that had an intellectual property chapter. We eliminated tariffs across the board. We opened up the agricultural market between the United States and Mexico. No other agreement has done that, indeed not multilaterally either. Services were brought in so that we could provide services across border, but we could do more. And so the path out, in my view, is to first have think tanks like CSIS point out the detriment of walking away. Have the business community like the Chamber, the Round Table, the services, and the NFTC and digital point up what the disaster would be. And then also maybe help formulate a path out, which I think is very much there. And that's what we need to do. We cannot, with 5% of the world's population, turn our backs on the rest of the world. We need to have our borders open. And it's not only with Mexico that we need to have that view, it's with the world at large. And I would say that it is not just with respect to our economic benefits, which are enormous, but our trade agreements have advanced our development interest. You know, if you think back to the Marshall Plan, and we helped rebuild the European community, the fact today, when we help and open markets for African nations, for Vietnam, they become our partners and our customers for tomorrow. You could call it an act of enlightened self-interest. And it also has a tremendous security benefit. If we watch countries around the world slip into deep poverty, and it's because their economies are stagnant, that's where we find international crime, terrorism, Ebola, and all kinds of things. So I compliment your panel. I came to learn and listen, not to talk, but thank you so much what you're adding to the intellectual knowledge that we need to move forward in the 21st century.
Let me say that back to you. Thank you. Well, I'm sorry for ambushing you, but I'm also not sorry because I'm glad that it validated my decision to do that because you're such an expert, but also a class act. So we really appreciate that input. Okay, let me just quickly, I know we're running out of time and I'm getting the axe, but I'm still going to take 2 questions because I didn't give people much time. Right here, and then there was somebody over there, maybe this gentleman here. Take them together and then we'll answer them quickly and then we'll take a break.
Hi, yes, thank you. My name is Isabel. I'm with Inside U.S. Trade, and just kind of going off of more what you were saying with the prospect of President-elect Trump pursuing 2 sort of separate bilateral deals, sitting down at a separate table with Mexico and another table with Canada. I'm kind of interested in hearing what the experts are thinking that the prospects will be with that, and how that would affect him kind of being able to declare a victory on renegotiating NAFTA in that sense.
Okay, and this gentleman. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, Eric Coolish, American Shipper Magazine's Adam Smith Project. Just curious if what you think the prospects are for a global trade war or more protectionism around the world when other countries see the lead that's with this more aggressive potential policy that might be coming out from the U.S. administration.
Worries about a broader global trade
Right, could it
war.
spark
Okay.
other countries to follow suit or take things further?
Okay, you want to take on either of those, Peter?
Well, I think, well, first of all, in terms of the question over here, my sense is that the president-elect is a negotiator, and part of negotiation, in many negotiations, is you start up here with your demands, and what you're really willing to settle for is somewhere in here. And hopefully that will be the pattern, and so that the more extreme rhetoric is simply to, put the other side off balance, but that, again, as I say, if the business community and others are putting on pressure for a more reasonable approach, then maybe we get to something that is, less catastrophic than perhaps the rhetoric would suggest. In terms of an all-out trade war, I think that also depends on what actually the administration does. And if it is more aggressive within the rules, that's one thing. If it imposes 45% tariffs on a country that is a member of the WTO, like China, then they certainly will find a way to retaliate, and that can lead to counter-retaliation and counter-retaliation and so forth. I don't think that we will have that happen, but it could happen if people are irresponsible about being aggressive.
So just to give Victoria and Bill a final chance to whether to answer those questions or to give, in a way that Peter has given advice, do smart things, not dumb things, to the new administration, any advice to them and to how to take these issues forward?
Well, I think I would just say, the new administration is not in place yet, and so I think there's still a fair amount of unpredictability. But the president-elect has been very consistent in saying that his focus is U.S. jobs, and I think a global trade war is not helpful in terms of creating U.S. jobs here. So from his focus on that, I would infer that there will not be a global trade war, because I do not think that would be helpful to creating jobs here in the United States, and he has been very clear that that is his focus. I think I've talked a lot about the data economy, the data trade agenda. So clearly, I think that's a place where the administration should focus, among others, in part because it will help create U.S. jobs here and it's good for U.S. competitiveness. But I would also say, just looking beyond the United States for a moment, having restrictions on data is also not helpful for other countries around the world and for the companies in those countries, because it means they don't have the best access to the best data services in the world, and that's slowing down their economic growth. And then the last thing I would say is, in my world, we are cloud computing and predictive data analytics and all the amazing things that are happening with that right now are very evident. But I would also say it's clear that we're just at the beginning. And there are so many exciting things happening, but this is all happening in the last few years, and I think we're at the beginning of the data revolution. And so one caution I have is, to the extent there are shadows put over the future of cloud computing or the future of predictive data analytics because of things like restrictive data policies, we shouldn't forget this is still a relatively new industry. It's doing incredible things, but it's relatively new, and putting a shadow of it on top of it kind of at its inception, I think will have really negative impacts, not just for the companies that are using it today, but for where the industry could go and for what it can mean to the global economy long term.
Fantastic. Okay, Bill?
I think just to, I agree with the others on the trade war issue. I won't say more about that. The only final comment I make is my advice, among other things, would be to lose this fascination with bilaterals. I think the argument that you get taken to the cleaners in regionals or plurilaterals is simply wrong. I think everybody that's negotiated them will tell you that it's wrong, and that there are situations where bilaterals are appropriate, because, and the UK is probably one of them. But the idea that regionals are bad, I think is misplaced, because I think it's demonstrably wrong, but also because going forward, negotiations are increasingly going to be about rules. They're going to be about the things that you guys have been talking about, and less about tariffs. It's a lot more efficient, and you avoid the spaghetti bowl problem at the end if you can negotiate a set of rules with a larger number of people. Now, you can make sort of the least common denominator case that, well, it might not be as good rules if we did it with one country, but if you negotiate rules with one country, then what have you got? You've got a set of rules for one country and nobody else. And then you've got to do that, you've got to replicate that multiple times. They'll all be different, which creates the uniformity problem. And it's just enormously inefficient. I particularly don't see it in NAFTA. You've got an existing trilateral agreement. Why do you want to blow that up and reinvent it as bilaterals? It seems to me that at some point he will articulate what he wants to accomplish with a renegotiation of NAFTA. There are other people other than him have talked about what that is. He has not really said much about what that is. Eventually there will be an agenda and we can look at it and respond, but it seems to me the way to deal with that agenda is within the existing framework. And the other two countries have said they're willing to have that discussion, so we should do it that way.
Okay, this is a huge and complex topic, and we've really, in a sense, only scratched the surface. But I personally learned a lot today, which I didn't. Doesn't surprise me, because these are the guys are the best, and I really think we need to continue this in all its dimensions, and as I said, follow up on some of the aspects of this story that are causing the anxiety, the fears, and the complaints about trade, and trying to take those head on, and we'll be doing more of that. But for now, please join me in thanking this fantastic panel for their comments. Thank you, guys. Really appreciate it.
I just want to say thank you. I served in government myself. I know the challenges, the demands, especially on family. You've been at this now for actually 9 years, because you started before it started, before administration started. I remember having conversations with you back after, I think it was like 3 days after the president was elected. And so you've really been at this for a long time. You've done such a splendid job. So on behalf of everybody here, I'd like to thank you for your wonderful service.
Well, thank you. Thanks
and
so
I
much.
think we should all give him a round of applause. Now, obviously, you're not coming here just to collect accolades, although we'd be glad to do that all morning.
That would be fine.
That'd be fine.
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
But I really do think we should explore. You've been on a mighty race here these last years to try to get a very large, complicated trade agreement in place during the remaining days of an administration. So you got a day here. You got all next week. But why don't you help us just reflect on TPP and where are we? I mean, in one sense, it was the great casualty of an election because it was disparaged. But I'm hearing little echoes suggesting there's still maybe a possibility.
Well, first of all, John, thanks very much for having me. And I just want to thank CSIS, yourself, Matt Goodman, Scott Miller, the work you all have done to put information about trade out there in the public. The Trade Vistas product, and among other things, has really been terrific. So thank you for all of that. I think you're right. I think the president convened all of the TPP leaders in November after the election in Peru on the margins of the APEC meeting. And what was interesting about that meeting is the other countries are remain very much committed to moving forward with TPP. And we're having active discussions about doing it with or without the United States. Obviously, they'd like the U.S. to be part of it over time, but they've also invested a lot of effort themselves in TPP being a lever for domestic reform in some of the countries, like Japan and agriculture, or Vietnam on a range of issues, Malaysia on a range of issues. And they want this platform to continue to move forward. We've also seen, somebody mentioned the other day, that countries are beginning to take bits and pieces of TPP and put them in other agreements. Now that it's out there and we've established a new standard in some of these areas, particularly some of the new areas, and I know you've had some discussion this morning about state-owned enterprises, about labor and environment, about the digital economy, that those chapters are now out there to be available for use by other countries. So I actually feel quite optimistic that the work that went into TPP, one way or another, one form or another, will find its way into effect. One senator the other day mentioned that we should renegotiate NAFTA by adding labor, the environment, and the digital economy.
We got a model here.
I've got an agreement to sell to them. But the fact is, those are out there, and I think that work will make its way into effect one way or the other.
Tell me, you spoke often about this as important for American economy and business, but also for America in leading a world and international norms in Asia. Would you take just a minute to reflect? What's at risk here?
Well, look, I think this was a key part of our engagement in the region. And our partners and allies very much want us to be. We are a Pacific power, we always have been. They've wanted us to be embedded in their lives. Not to contain China by any means, but the more that China grows in its importance and dominance in the region, the more they want the U.S. to be there to diversify their partnerships, to diversify their markets. And what's at stake if TPP doesn't move forward in some form or another is that not only we lose the economic benefits, which are substantial to the U.S. economy, but we've shot ourselves in the foot on leadership in the region and global leadership. Prime Minister Lee, former Prime Minister Key of New Zealand, Prime Minister Abe have all talked about how if TPP doesn't move forward, it is great damage. It causes great damage to the credibility of U.S. leadership in the region. It creates a void that China is all too willing to fill. and that even our closest military allies and partners will feel the need to line up behind them. And that, to be frank, I'm a bit perplexed, because it's hard to be tough on China, as we heard a lot about during this campaign, and withdraw from TPP at the same time. Withdrawing from TPP would be a huge gift to China in terms of damaging the U.S. role in the region. And I can't understand why any president or administration would want to hand the keys of the castle over to China to say it's better that China set the rules for this region rather than the United States. I think that would have very damaging consequences.
One of the things I admired about your personal style and your model was that you were quite open in dealing with across the aisle, Republicans and Democrats. I know that you're sustaining some of that narrative now. What are you now hearing about the possibility of picking this up at the right time? I realize nothing's going to happen right now. Emotions are raw and that sort of thing.
I spent in the months leading up to the election, through most of 2016, at the suggestion of the Republican leadership in the House, I went around and met individually with almost 100 House Republicans in the months leading up there. And I think the good news is, on the substance of TPP, we've won. Virtually nobody questioned the value of TPP to the United States economically and strategically. They were concerned about the politics, particularly in the context of the campaign. They wondered how their leaders were going to bring it forward and when, but there was a deep reservoir of support for TPP in Congress should it come to a vote. And I'm convinced that had the leadership brought it up for a vote and mobilized its whip operation, we could have generated the necessary votes to get it done. So hopefully over time, as the new administration works through trade policy and other issues that are important to Congress, there will be a way to come back to this at some point in the future and figure out how to take it forward in one form or another.
The president-elect often, when he would talk of this, would try to say, look, my predecessors were a bunch of dummies. I could negotiate a better treaty.
I heard that.
You heard that. Discounting his comment about you, what are there areas where we could do a little bit to improve TPP so that he could take credit for a victory here?
Look, there is no doubt. There is no such thing as a perfect trade agreement. And I said to every stakeholder group, nobody is going to get 100% of what they want in 100% of the chapters. I mentioned that to a member of Congress once when we were talking about TPP, and he laughed at me and he said, if we get 60% of what we want in a bill, that's a huge victory. Well, I think when we look across this agreement, across the broad range of stakeholders, I think we did much better than that. And even if it's not 100%, it came close. There may be ways to improve it, and the new administration will want to take a hard look at it and see what they think of it once they dig into the details. I do hope they take the time to dig into the details and learn about what's actually in it and who's actually in it to help inform whatever policy they pursue going forward. But this was, as you know, the reason it took 5 years of really hard negotiation, and actually it started near the end of the Bush administration, so by some measure it took 7 years, 8 years to get done, is because it was very much a multi-dimensional chess game with 11 countries, 12 countries in total, some of whom we already had FTAs with, which meant we didn't have anything to offer them in terms of new market access. But we wanted them to raise their standards anyway. And so how we used the fact that it wasn't a bilateral agreement, we were, in many respects, playing with house money. We were helping countries get access to countries like Japan. They were riding on our coattails to get access to Japan as a way of encouraging them to adopt stronger labor and environmental standards, better intellectual property rights, disciplines on state-owned enterprises, digital economy rules, because we didn't have anything to offer them ourselves. And so when I hear conversations about bilateral versus multilateral, there certainly is a place for bilateral agreements, but a lot of what we got out of TPP was precisely because it was a broader agreement. We were able to to have countries ride on our coattails and get things that they otherwise couldn't get on their own. And there were countries, like Malaysia, where the Bush administration had tried to do an FTA with Malaysia in the 2005, 2006 period. It failed. And it failed in part because it was hard for Malaysia to give concessions to the United States, the great United States coming in and demanding things of them. It's part of a larger agreement when they have fellow ASEAN members in the room. And they're also getting access not just to the United States, but to other countries, other big countries, Japan, Mexico, others. It changes the politics in these countries. So it's a much more complicated negotiation than I think some have really gotten their heads around. And I hope that when the new team comes in, they dig in and really understand what's possible in terms of adding to it or changing it, and what's actually there.
You've had some exposure to a transition team or a landing team. Can you give us any insights into how people are thinking about it with the next administration?
Well, we have had a landing team at USTR, and in fact, Bob Lighthizer, who's the president's nominee for USTR, has been helping to lead that landing team. So they have been in a couple of times, and we've been providing information to them to make sure this is as smooth a transition as possible. We're fully committed to making it a fully and smooth transition. In terms of their policy direction, I don't have any great insights, and I think we'll just have to wait and see and give them the time and space they need to go through the policy process.
What do you think about this implication of border fee adjustments? Share with us your thoughts.
You know, there are a lot of different ideas out there about the border tax adjustment, the destination-based cash flow tax system. So it's a little unclear. There would be different ramifications for different ideas. You know, there certainly is an issue out there that some countries have VATs and some countries have sales taxes, and that's an issue that's been long discussed in the trading system. I think what is a challenge is if it's a system that gets adopted that inherently discriminates against imports and promotes exports only, that could raise international trade implications, as well as, of course, have an impact on consumers in the United States and on manufacturers and others who rely on inputs as part of their production process.
We still import a lot of oil.
Yeah. We import a lot of oil, a lot of manufactured product that become inputs into our manufactured products that then get exported. And it's not just manufacturing. The relationship between services and manufacturing is so integral now. If you hurt one sector, you hurt the other sector as well. So I think one of the challenges for any incoming administration is as they move from campaigning to governing, it's important to think through second and third order effects of policies. A lot of things feel really good on day one. And then you think about, well, what happens if other countries retaliate? What happens if other countries imitate? And some of those same policies look a little bit less good. If you think about, we all want to drive more manufacturing to the United States. That's been a high priority of our administration. I'm sure it has of previous administrations as well. Our approach had been make the U.S. an attractive place to invest, including by having these trade agreements that make the U.S. a good place to export, a platform to export to other countries. If you start saying, in order to have access to our market, you have to move your manufacturing here, that has a certain appeal, but those are also the kinds of barriers that we have been fighting against in other countries. Imagine if China tomorrow said, Boeing, you want to sell more planes in China? That is the fastest growing market for airplanes. You've now got to move all of your production to China. We would be up in arms about that. And so I think we need to think through what happens if other countries, given the fact that 95% of the world's consumers, 80% of the world's purchasing power, the fastest growing markets, the fastest growing demand for a lot of our manufactured products is outside the United States. We have to think through, again, the second and third order implications of this.
TTIP kind of disappeared in public consciousness this last year. Do you have any thoughts about what might come here in the next year or so?
Well, I had a video conference with Cecilia Malmström this morning. We're still, by the way, we're running through the tape on this. This morning we announced an agreement with the EU on what's called the covered agreement. Covers insurance and reassurance issues, and we're still working through some issues with them. Yesterday we announced a major new enforcement action against China on aluminum overcapacity, and we're going to continue working till noon on the 20th. But I think in terms of TTIP, what became clear last year is that for a whole variety of reasons, the EU wasn't prepared to reach an ambitious agreement right now. And we spent a good part of the summer figuring out what a final package could look like. We started talking about it with the European Union, and it became clear they weren't ready to talk about the elimination of agricultural tariffs or the digital economy or some of the services issues. Having said that, I think we did make a lot of progress, including on regulatory and standards issues. And we're in the process of trying to make sure we take a good snapshot of where we are in the negotiations, not just where the text is, but where the bid ask in the negotiations were, what were possible compromises that were on the table, so that if the next administration, and when the next administration wants to pick it up, they'll be able to pick it up with momentum.
Do you see any prospect until the Brexit issue gets kind of worked through on how they're going to manage the relationship between the UK economy and the EU economy?
Well, I think in terms of TTIP, we probably have to wait for the French and German elections to pass before there'll be a clearer political signal about what direction the EU wants to go in. I think the EU also has to work through this issue of, are trade agreements going to be approved by the European Commission, Council, and Parliament, or also by 38 regional parliaments? And we saw in the context of CETA how if every regional parliament, including I believe 5 regional parliaments in Belgium alone, can hold up a trade agreement, it's going to be very difficult to negotiate something with the EU. I think in terms of the UK, there's a lot of interest. I know, or I've read in the incoming administration in a bilateral agreement with the UK. And I think when the president said they're at the back of the queue, that was just a recognition that TTIP is our priority. And as a practical matter, it's going to take time for the UK to sort out its relationship with the EU before you can really have a negotiation of a bilateral agreement. Right now, there are a lot of ideas floating around within the UK, let alone between the UK and the EU, about what their relationship is going to be. But for example, if they're going to have a customs union with the European Union, that means the EU controls their tariffs. So you can't really negotiate an FTA with a partner who doesn't have sovereignty over their tariffs. Will they have sovereignty over certain regulation? What part will that play in an FTA? So it's all that is to say that of course we're going to want to have deep relations with the United Kingdom. We have a special relationship, but we have to see what their relationship is going to be defined by with the EU before we can really have any intelligent conversations about a bilateral agreement.
I have one last question I'm going to turn to all of you, but let me ask Ambassador, trade negotiations are usually working through the things that were important 10 and 20 and 30 years ago, and they're still stuck in our regulatory environment. And the world is changing, economies are dynamic. And I know you're working through that now, but what do you see happening in the global economy that now we should be thinking about looking forward here, assuming we have future rounds of thinking here?
Well, look, I think one of the issues that we were, I think, quite innovative around in TPP was the digital economy. And I know you heard a little bit from Victoria about this this morning, but that is a new issue. It is a cutting edge issue, and it's only going to grow in importance as data and data flows grow exponentially. This isn't just an issue for internet companies or for technology companies. Every manufacturing company and most services companies are increasingly dependent on the flows of data and the free flow of data across borders. And so establishing rules that allow that free flow of data is critically important, as well as the other rules around the digital economy. I think we're having an interesting conversation now at the WTO, now that we've gotten out of our Doha cul-de-sac. about what new issues might be put on the agenda. And issues like e-commerce and the digital economy are certainly among those. So I think that's going to be critically important. I think the other thing important that we need to be focused on, and it's more of a domestic issue than an international one, is the whole area of how to prepare the American public for a rapidly changing economy. I think a lot of what we saw in this last election were people's quite real and legitimate economic anxieties about the rapidity of change. Plus, you had wage stagnation, you had widening income inequality, and you see a lot of the anger being rooted in quite fundamental economic and technological developments. People talk about trade displacing jobs, and we can have that debate, and I think most economists would agree that upwards of 80% or even higher of any job displacement is actually due to technology, not to globalization. But those of you who've been talking to the technology community know we're really just seeing the tip of the iceberg on that.
Oh, yeah.
And when you start thinking about artificial intelligence and 3D printing and a number of other new cutting edge developments, how that's going to affect manufacturing and the services sector in the United States, we need to really rethink, not just TAA and trade adjustment assistance, but education, lifelong learning, skills building, mobility, and there are a lot of other countries and some states within the United States who have experimented and do this better than we do at the federal level. And we should look around. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, but we should try and understand what the best practices are around the world and figure out which ones make sense in our system. Otherwise, what we see around the populist uprising against globalization will pale in comparison to what we see around the same sort of feeling when jobs are displaced by artificial intelligence and other new technological developments.
That's a theme that comes out more often in every meeting I have now. It's amazing. Okay, colleagues, let me open up. There are going to be some questions from all of you. You know a hell of a lot more about trade than I do, so let me open it up to the floor. Back here, sir, do we have a microphone? Right, yeah, right here. No, there you go. Thank you. Please say who you are, tight questions, and if they're lectures, I'm going to shut you down.
No lecture here.
Okay.
Zach Struver from Knowledge Ecology International. My question for you, Ambassador Froman, is do you regret attempting to block compulsory licenses on cancer medicines in India?
Well, first of all, we've never tried to block compulsory licenses on cancer medicines in India. There are provisions for compulsory licenses under the WTO agreement. We fully support those provisions in terms of how compulsory licenses should be used. We've restated that over and over again. We do encourage governments to work with companies to figure out how best to get access to innovative medicines, and that's been our stated policy.
Okay, right back in the middle, about halfway back. Yeah, stand up and then we'll get the microphone over to you.
Hi, Bob Davis with Wall Street Journal. I wanted to ask you about the slowdown in trade, which has picked up steam since around 2007. How significant do you think that is? How much of that is protection? And also on your comments about the sort of build in America, Trump's ideas on border tax and so on, are you concerned that that will feed into this sort of protectionist sentiment and a slowdown in trade?
Well, I am concerned about the slowdown in trade. As you know, global trade used to grow at almost twice the rate of global economic growth, and that was helping to draw and lead to further global economic growth. That changed in recent years. I think some of it changed for reasons of changing supply chains, that China, rather than importing a lot of inputs, now produces those inputs themselves, and so you see some changes within the Asian supply chains. But some of it is certainly increasing protectionism of new sorts, including localization barriers and other non-tariff barriers. And so that is of concern. And if we want to see the global economy, including the US economy, be on a higher trajectory of growth, certainly opening markets and getting rid of some of these barriers is going to be critical to that. We are so efficient here in the United States as a producer in agriculture and a number of other products. We need these foreign markets if we're going to have the kind of well-paying jobs maintained and created in the United States. So I think it's very important that we take action when we see protectionism, that we highlight it, that we take WTO action if necessary, as we did just yesterday, again, against China, our 16th case against China over the course of this administration. We've brought 25 cases to the WTO in total, more than any other country, and that we continue to hold countries' feet to the fire to get rid of these protectionist steps. I think on your other question, I raise it as a question that if you take issues like raising tariffs on imports, you'll see countries potentially retaliate against us if we're doing something that's clearly illegal. You'll see countries potentially imitate us, and we'll find ourselves at the other end of the stick, where our export industries and the jobs, the 11.5 million jobs that they support, are put at risk because other countries are raising their tariffs. And then, of course, raising tariffs is a tax. It's a tax on the part of our economy, part of our society who are least able to afford it. The Council of Economic Advisors put out a study yesterday looking at the regressive nature of tariffs and how it's the lowest quintile of income, low-income Americans who pay disproportionately the tariffs. And so you're hurting the people who you most want to help in society. And for all those reasons, I think we just have to think, take a step and think through all the secondary and tertiary impacts.
Down here in the second row, why don't you stand up so that way she can see you? Stand up, please.
Jin Lo from Chinese Embassy. Thank you, Mr. Hamre, and thank you, Mr. Froman. First, in President-elect Donald Trump's mind, the United States is a big loser of international trade. And how do you think about that? And what do you think
How do I think about Donald Trump's mind?
The argument.
I'm not going to touch that
big
one
loser.
with a 10-foot
Okay.
pole, but,
And what do you think could be the reasonable explanation to the frustration and and anger that voters have right now? And the second, Mr. Donald Trump now his strategy to persuade and even urge big companies to withdraw their investment overseas and to stay and expand their factories here. And do you think that will last long? Because that's something different from the market economy rules. And how long and how far you think he can go? The third, you have a very good negotiation, BIT negotiation with China. It's bilateral, it's about investment. Do you think President-elect Donald Trump could take that onto his agenda? Thank you.
I have to write these down. I know this will be surprising, but I am not a spokesman for the Trump incoming administration. And I don't have any great insights other than what you and I read in the newspaper. So I won't try and speculate. Look, I think, let me go to your first question. There is a lot of anger around the country. And I mentioned, I think it may well be driven more by technology than trade. I think there is a great sense among a lot of Americans that not all countries are playing by the same set of rules and that we're being taken advantage of. And I think you see that expressed. And look, it's a very interesting study that David O'Toole and his colleagues have done of looking about where Chinese imports into the United States have had the biggest impact and where the anger and the support for President-elect Trump was. It's a very interesting study. And David O'Toole is not anti-trade. I mean, he's actually a supporter of TPP. But he's pointing out the concern that if Americans are feeling like other countries, and to be frank, China is number one on the list, are not upholding their obligations, not living by the same set of rules, taking advantage of access to our markets, it makes them very angry, and it has political implications. And I think that's why it's so important, and why from President Obama on down, the Strategic and Economic Dialogue, the Joint Commission on Commerce and Trade, the G20, all of our interaction with China and Chinese leaders has been to encourage them to take greater responsibility for the global trading system, to be a responsible participant in that system, to uphold the rules, and to make sure that there continues to be support for openness. Otherwise, I think you will see, and you are seeing, a counter reaction.
Okay, yes, right back here in the, thank you.
Thank you. Tori from the Heritage Foundation. So Ambassador Froman, the previous panel spoke at great length about the need for the business community to speak up about the potential renegotiation of NAFTA, given obviously their extensive interests in what happens with that with supply chains, especially in the auto industry. What would your thoughts be on the capacity for stakeholders, like automakers, to speak up in this circumstance, given the current attacks on many of their business decisions here in the United States?
Well, look, I think we need a new model of thinking about stakeholder engagement on these issues. I think the days are gone when a few trade associations and yes, even a few think tanks could get mobilized around a vote, put out reports, hire a few lobbyists, and get trade agreements through Congress. I think those days are gone. I think we need an all-out, long-term public engagement effort that helps people understand what's at stake. How much they already rely on trade in ways that they may not even imagine, whether it's through their job and the fact that their job is dependent on exports, or whether it's as consumers and how much of what they take for granted, the iPhone that they have that would cost more than $2,000 if we disrupted trade, where only wealthy people would have iPhones, not the single mother who uses the iPhone to FaceTime with her kids after school, during a break at work. I mean, we have to make this real to people, that there is a lot at stake, and a lot at stake for them personally. I think that's one of the lessons of the last couple of years, has been that we haven't done enough of that. I hope the business community will speak up, because they have certainly they have an understanding of what the dynamic is, how to maintain competitiveness here globally, and what role trade plays in that. They clearly have priorities right now that are more around taxes and regulations, but I hope they will also speak up around trade, and I hope that we can engage. I mean, the kind of education effort I have in mind, an engagement effort, is much more like we did on the importance of recycling or the health effects of smoking. These are wide, broad. They're not about particular agreements. They're not about particular votes. They're not tied to a particular congressional schedule. It's letting people know really what's at stake in their lives by withdrawing from the international economy, by losing U.S. leadership, and how it affects them in real day-to-day way. And I think the business community, as well as others, have a big role to play in that.
Yes, sir. Right over here. Microphone's coming right down.
Hi, Eric Coolish, American Shipper Magazine's Adam Smith project. To that point, what about the whole e-commerce and digital economy? Is that a mechanism or a lever that might get people to think more positively about trade, because people have a one-to-one direct connection with that shipment? They see it, they track it, versus the amorphous shipments that just flow into Walmart, sight unseen. Do you see that as maybe a way to drum up support or interest in the populace in general?
Absolutely, I think that could be a big part of that. And we, during our work on TPP, we met with sellers on eBay and sellers on Etsy, as well as the UPSs and FedExs and DHLs of the world. And for those individual sellers, take Etsy. Etsy's, I think, 88% women, many working out of their homes, making something and selling it halfway across the world. They're small businesses in the very smallest sense of the word, and they're benefiting when they sell that product from their home in Bethesda to a customer in Australia. They're using telecom services, software services, electronic payment services, express delivery services. We take that all for granted, that you can go online, click a button, send something halfway across the world, and that will actually get there. But those are all areas where there is risk to openness, where countries are saying, well, we want to localize electronic payments. We don't want to allow express delivery to be done by international shippers. And I think for for those individuals, we need to make sure that they are articulating why and help them see the link between what they're doing and the kinds of rules that we're negotiating in TPP and other trade agreements.
Right down here in the front, and then I'll come to you next, and then you get the last one, and I want to let it get out of here.
Thank you. Robert Rogowski, the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. And a lot of lament has been expressed about losing American leadership, and particularly Chinese leadership taking over. Given the vast momentum of 70 years of building an international order, can you clarify a little bit of what the fear is about Chinese leadership? Is it vague? It seems a little vague to me, but could you clarify a little bit what the concerns are and what you think it might be different, what the world might look like differently if China did take a more dramatic leadership role?
Well, I'd say two things about that. One is China has a regional strategy for the Asia Pacific. Look at the Silk Road Initiative, the One Belt, One Road, RCEP, the trade agreement that they're negotiating, 16 countries. Even South China Sea is obviously part of a regional strategy. And they're executing on that strategy. And that positions them in a very powerful way to, in the region, to be able to call the shots. I think the U.S. isn't looking to displace China, but we think it's important that the U.S. also be engaged in the region, and that our allies and partners in the region can diversify their relationships, diversify their markets, not become overly dependent on one country, and that the interactions in the region be based on the open, rules-based approach that we've defended for 70 years, not about one country throwing its weight around. I think you don't have to, it's not a theoretical issue. If you look at RCEP as an example, the trade agreement versus TPP. I mean, China, I don't think I'm saying anything controversial to say China has a different approach to state-owned enterprises than we do, than the disciplines in TPP. China has a different approach to intellectual property rights protection, to the free flow of data, to a free and open internet, to labor and environmental protections. You know, in TPP, we've got protections of oceans and illegal logging and illegal fishing and the subsidization of overfishing, wildlife protection. We've got protection of the marine environment. You know, those are things that are in TPP that aren't in RCEP. Labor, we have, look at the labor consistency plan that Vietnam negotiated to allow independent labor unions that can organize, strike, collect their own finances, elect their own leaders, affiliate with who they want to, and that those obligations are binding and enforceable. That if they don't do those things, they don't get access to our market. There's nothing like that in RCEP. So if you care about labor, you care about environment, you care about human trafficking, you care about IPR, you care about state-owned companies competing on a fair and level playing field with private firms. All of these issues, there is a choice. And I think it's very much in the interests of American workers and farmers and ranchers and businesses that the rules defining the Asia Pacific, which in many respects will be the rules that define the global trading system, that they reflect our interests and our values.
This lady right here in the second row. Yeah, please stand up so that she can bring the microphone to you.
Chia Ching from United Daily News Media from Taiwan. So instead of China, I want to ask the question about Taiwan. I'm just wondering if you talked to Mr. Lighthizer about the U.S.-Taiwan trade relationships, since Taiwan's our 9th largest trade partner. And if not, what are your suggestions to improve the U.S.-Taiwan trade relationship?
We've not discussed Taiwan specifically. Look, I think over the course of our administration, consistent with the policies that have been laid out for several decades, we've had our trade and investment agreement consultations. And we've talked about resolving some of our outstanding trade issues. We still have a lot of issues with Taiwan around pork, beef, and other agricultural products that we're having difficulty getting into Taiwan. And we'll certainly encourage them to continue that work to try and eliminate those barriers and and deepen our relationship consistent with the approaches that we and previous administrations have taken.
Last question is going to be right here in the second row, so we'll bring a mic over here, right to your left, or your right, I should say.
Thank you. Carl Dahlman from the Growth Dialogue. I wanted to follow up on a question that John asked you about looking forward. You pointed out that studies show that most of the job losses don't come from trade. In fact, trade is very beneficial, but come from the rapid technology, and that we're just at the beginning of that. So just like you said, we have to educate people about the benefits of trade. What do you think can be done to prepare citizens in general to understand the new economy we're living in, the dramatic transformations which are coming, and the role of government policy in trying to deal with that? You said there were some countries that were doing some interesting things, even some states. How can that be leveraged? Because we need that. Because right now the focus is on trade, but it's to some extent it's misdirected, and the real issue is how do we get resilience in the economy being able to adjust?
Well, I think that's absolutely right. Look, we don't, as I've often said, you don't get to vote on technology. There isn't a referendum on the next generation of software or whether robots are going to be introduced into the working place. You don't really get to vote on globalization. It's just a force. It's a product of containerization of shipping and the spread of broadband and a lot of other factors. So trade agreements become the scapegoat, frankly. They become the vessel into which people pour their real and legitimate economic anxieties. But and because that's the one thing you get to vote on, it becomes a scapegoat. I think the good news is, as the Pew and Foundation and others have shown, there actually is more support out there for trade than the recent politics would suggest. The majority of Americans understand the importance of international engagement, of trade. They see it more as an opportunity than a threat, and particularly young people. The largest cohort of supporters of trade are young people who, not surprisingly, have been online since birth and have contacts all over the world, think of themselves, they're more likely to have a passport, think they're going to travel, work, or live abroad, feel plugged in internationally vis-a-vis technology, and they tend to be the most pro-trade. So that gives me optimism for the future, but we really do need, as you said, to crack this nut on not only transition assistance, but preparing people in the first place to succeed in a rapidly changing economy. The workplace is going to change in dramatic ways in the next 5, 10, 20 years. And that means rethinking a lot of what we do in terms of education, and apprenticeships, and vocational training, and community colleges, and a lot of ideas out there. Singapore has a lot of ideas about how to train people who are in declining industries and moving them into rising industries. Korea, Scandinavia, and across the US, there are a number of interesting experiments. But it takes a conscious effort. People like Mark Warner, Senator Mark Warner, is doing a lot of thinking about the future of work. There are others out there as well. And I think that's just something we're going to need to do, regardless of trade. I think that really goes to maintaining the social compact in the United States that allows there to be coherence and stability in our politics.
I promised the ambassador that we'd let him get out of here. I'm a little, almost over the edge, but I do want to say how grateful we are. This has been a marvelous discussion. You've given us not only the insights of the philosophy that guided you, but you've also given us a nice insight into what it means to be a U.S. trade representative. You've done a splendid job, Ambassador. Would you all please say thank you? It's wonderful. Really, really good.